The patient on table 3 had been flatlined for 47 seconds when the nurse they'd just suspended walked back through the door. She hadn't been asked to come back. She had no badge. She had a paper bag with her locker contents under one arm and a look on her face that nobody in that operating room could read. She set the bag down on a metal tray, pulled on a pair of gloves from the wall dispenser, and moved to the table like she owned the room, or like she'd worked in rooms much worse than this one. 47 seconds became 48. Then she made one call. One quiet, precise decision. And the monitor changed. The room went silent for a different reason. If you're watching this story until the very end, hit follow right now, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it started. Silver Harbor sat on the northern edge of a coastline that had never decided what it wanted to be. Part industrial, part gentrified. The kind of city where a coffee shop opened next to a machine shop and both somehow survived. Northgate Medical Center occupied 6 city blocks near the harbor district. Older buildings grafted onto newer wings, corridors that didn't quite line up, elevator banks that serviced some floors and skipped others for reasons nobody alive could fully explain. It was, by most metrics, a functional hospital. Decent trauma numbers. Reasonable mortality rates, at least on paper. A board that liked to cite rankings in their donor newsletters. The staff knew better than to believe the newsletters, but they also knew better than to say so in the wrong hallway. Emily Hart had worked Northgate's surgical floor for 2 years and 11 months. She knew every quirk of the place. Which supply closet stuck, which call button on the 3rd floor had a half-second lag, which attending physicians ran late and which ones ran angry. She knew the rhythms of the building the way a person knows their own heartbeat. Not because she was sentimental about it, because she was trained to learn environments fast. Because in other rooms, in other years, not knowing the layout of a space could kill someone. None of her colleagues knew that part. They knew her as the nurse who showed up early, didn't make small talk, and once corrected a dosage calculation on a chart without saying anything to the ordering physician. Just flagged it to the pharmacist and moved on. Efficient. A little cold, some said. Quietly capable, others admitted, in the way people admit things they don't want to fully acknowledge. The surgical floor ran on a hierarchy that had calcified over years into something close to ritual. At the top of Emily's immediate world sat Dr. Preston Hale, the kind of surgeon who wore his confidence like armor and occasionally forgot there were people wearing the armor with him. Below him in practice, if not in title, was Darlene Voss, the charge nurse, who had worked this floor for 16 years and treated that tenure like a property deed. She managed the nursing staff with a competence that bordered on surveillance, always watching, always filing, always 2 steps ahead of any complaint that might reflect poorly on her. Emily existed in Darlene's orbit the way a smaller object exists near something with too much gravity. Managed. Redirected. Occasionally credited for things Darlene then mentioned in a way that made the credit feel like a loan. On the morning it all started, Emily was 20 minutes into her shift when she noticed something wrong with room 14. Walter Grimes was 58, a retired harbor pilot who'd come in for a coronary artery bypass 3 days prior. The surgery had gone well by official measure. His recovery notes were clean. But Emily had checked on him twice in the past hour, and the second time she'd stood at the doorway longer than usual, running through the discrepancies she couldn't quite name. His pain charting didn't match his behavior. He was reporting 4s and 5s. He was holding himself like an 8. She pulled his file at the nursing station and cross-referenced his medication log. His last bolus had been documented, timestamp, dosage, the works, but the way he'd reached for the bed rail when she'd walked in, the slight catch in his breathing, the way his jaw had gone tight when she'd touched his wrist to check his pulse. People in moderate pain didn't do that. "You're spending a lot of time on the Grimes chart," Darlene said, appearing at her elbow without preamble. "His pain scores feel off. His scores are what he reported." "I know what he reported. I'm saying they feel off." Darlene looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she used when she was deciding whether to engage or dismiss. She chose the middle path, a half nod that meant nothing, and walked away. Emily flagged it in the system with a nursing note and went back to her rounds. 40 minutes later, Walter Grimes' monitor alarmed from the hallway. She was already moving before the second alarm fired. Room 14 was at the far end of the corridor, and she covered it in seconds, pushing through the door to find him in the early stages of what she recognized immediately as a cascade. Heart rate spiking, blood pressure dropping, his face a color that had no place on a post-surgical patient 3 days out. She hit the call button and started running through the response from muscle memory, not procedure. There was a difference, and it showed. Her hands were already on him before the intercom crackled, her assessment moving faster than the room could catch up to. "He's going septic," she said to the aide who appeared in the doorway. "I need the rapid response team, and I need them now, not after someone confirms the obvious." The aide disappeared. Emily worked. She was in the middle of repositioning his IV line when she became aware of a presence behind her. And then Dr. Preston Hale was moving her aside with a shoulder and a look that made the motion feel like something you weren't supposed to notice. "I've got it," he said. She stepped back. That was protocol. She knew it and she followed it, even though she'd already done the work that bought them the next 3 minutes. The rapid response team arrived. Hale directed. The patient stabilized slowly and then with more confidence, and the room returned to something approximating order. Emily stood at the edge of it, watching the chart, watching Hale, watching the way the numbers moved. She was still watching when Marcus Slade walked in. Slade was Northgate's Vice President of Clinical Operations, which was a title that meant different things depending on who was asking. To the board, it meant efficiency. To the medical staff, it meant the person who stood between a complaint and anything actually happening. He was 47, fit in the way corporate people sometimes were, like staying in shape was part of the job, which for him it probably was. He wore his lanyard like a credential instead of an ID badge, and he had the particular quality of moving through a room and making it feel like he'd been there longest. He shouldn't have been here this fast. The code had barely cleared. Emily clocked the timeline in the back of her head and felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite certainty. He and Hale spoke in the hallway for 4 minutes. She couldn't hear it. She didn't need to. When they came back in, Hale looked at her the way people look at something they're deciding whether to step around or step over. "We need a few minutes with you," Slade said. Well, the meeting was in a conference room on the administrative floor, the kind of room that had been designed to feel neutral and managed to feel like the opposite. Slade sat across the table from her. Hale stood to the side, which told her something. Patrice Moon, the HR director, sat at the end with a folder and an expression that had been engineered for this exact situation, professionally concerned, personally uninvested. "There are some concerns about how the incident in room 14 was handled," Slade began. "I initiated a rapid response based on observable clinical changes," Emily said. "The patient was, you bypassed standard escalation protocol. I flagged it in the system 40 minutes ago. My note is time-stamped." Patrice Moon wrote something in the folder. Emily watched her write it. "There are also questions," Hale said, "about interventions you made before the team arrived, repositioning the line without a physician order." "He was going septic." "That's a diagnosis, not a nursing assessment." It was correct. The word landed flat and nobody responded to it, which was its own kind of answer. Emily kept her face still. She'd sat in rooms before where the conclusion had been decided, and the meeting was just the paperwork that followed. She'd sat in worse rooms. She knew how to wait. "We're initiating a temporary administrative suspension pending review of the incident," Slade said. "This isn't punitive, it's procedural." "It's punitive." "Emily." Patrice Moon's voice carried the gentle weight of someone who'd had this conversation many times. "We're trying to protect you as much as the hospital." "You're trying to protect the hospital." She looked at Slade. "What's in the supply closet on 3 that's been locked for the past 6 days?" A beat, barely visible, but there. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Slade said. "I am," she said, and she let that sit. He placed a lanyard badge reader card on the table. "We'll need your access credentials and your badge." She looked at the card. She looked at him. "Turn in your badge and leave," he said. She reached up slowly and unclipped her badge from her scrubs, set it on the table. "Not until I understand why a patient who was flagged 40 minutes ago nearly died, and the first thing this hospital did was convene an HR meeting. The review will address, I want that in writing." Patrice Moon began to say something about the process. Emily stopped listening. She was watching Slade watch her, and in the way he held himself, not angry, not guilty, just careful, she felt the shape of something she didn't have a name for yet. She stood. She picked up the card he'd placed on the table and set her badge on top of it. "I'll see myself out," she said. The walk back through the surgical floor was the kind of thing she'd trained herself not to feel while it was happening. Save it for later, process it after. That was an old discipline from old training, and it still held. She kept her eyes forward and her pace even. Tomas Reyes was at the nursing station when she passed, 26, 2 years in. The kind of nurse who still cared enough to look guilty about things that weren't his fault. He met her eyes and then looked away. And that small thing, that deflection, landed harder than anything Slade had said. Darlene was at the end of the corridor. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The satisfaction was right there, worn openly, because she'd been in the room long enough to stop pretending at things. Emily pushed through the stairwell door and walked down 3 floors to the locker room. She had 14 minutes before her temporary credentials expired. She knew this because she knew exactly how Northgate's system handled suspensions. A phased lockout, not an immediate one, because the IT vendor had built it that way, and nobody had ever bothered to change it. She'd noticed this 8 months ago during a routine access audit she'd been asked to help with, and then not thanked for. She changed out of her scrubs. She packed the few things from her locker into a paper bag. A spare pen, a granola bar, a paperback that she hadn't had time to read. Then she sat on the bench and pulled out her personal phone. She opened the note app and started writing down exactly what she'd seen in that room. Times, observations, the specific quality of Walter Grimes's breathing, the way the chart timestamps didn't line up, the locked supply room on 3, Slade arriving faster than the incident could have traveled to his office. She wrote it quickly, cleanly, without editorializing. She'd been trained to write incident reports that way. Different context. Same skill. Then she looked at the time, picked up her bag, and walked back toward the exit, but not the one she'd been escorted toward. There was a records terminal on the 2nd floor that the charge nurses used for pulling archived patient files, separate from the main nursing station system. It was slower, and it was old, and people avoided it because the interface was a vintage disaster. Emily had used it 3 times in the past year, and each time had been logged under her general nursing credentials rather than her specific badge ID, a quirk of the older software that nobody had patched. She sat down. She had 9 minutes of access, probably less. She pulled Walter Grimes' pre-surgical file. She found the safety flags she'd suspected. 3 of them, flagged by a pre-op nurse whose name Emily recognized, cleared within 6 hours. The clearance time stamped to a physician whose signature appeared on 12 other clearances that same day. A physician who, according to the surgery schedule Emily could also see, had been in 2 different ORs during 2 of those timestamp windows. You couldn't be in 2 operating rooms at the same time. That wasn't ambiguity. That was a record that had been signed by someone who hadn't actually looked at it. She went to the next file. A woman named Patricia Keene, 63, readmitted 2 weeks after a routine procedure. Outcome, reclassified. The reclassification code in the system mapped to a category that reduced reportable adverse events. Emily had seen this code used correctly a handful of times. This wasn't correct usage. Patricia Keene had died during that readmission. 3rd file. Man named Dwan Okafor, 49, a complication that the system listed as resolved. Except the complication resolution was timestamped 12 hours before the physician note that described it. Events didn't resolve before they were documented, not unless the documentation was working backward from a desired outcome. 7 minutes. She was running out of time and she already had more than she'd come looking for. She pulled a personal USB drive from her pocket. She'd kept one in her locker since a year ago when she'd backed up a continuing education certificate and just never removed it, and copied the 3 files and the access log she'd been building in her head into a document she typed fast, shorthand, barely readable to anyone who didn't know the notation system she'd once used for field reports. 5 minutes. She logged out of the terminal and wiped her session, walked to the stairwell, down to the parking garage. The paper bag was still under her arm. The drive was in her left hand. She found her car in Section C, parked where she always parked, and she sat in it for 2 minutes with the engine off and the window cracked. She was good at still, She'd always been good at still. Then she looked at her windshield. There was a piece of paper tucked under the wiper blade on the driver's side. Not a parking notice, not a flyer. A folded sheet of white paper, the kind from an office printer, and it had been placed there recently. The fold was clean, the paper hadn't been rained on, and it hadn't been there when she'd arrived that morning. She got out of the car. She took the paper without unfolding it and got back in. She unfolded it. You copied files that don't belong to you. Return the drive or we file charges tonight. She looked up from the paper, scanned the parking garage through the windshield, the ramp up to level 2, the concrete pillar to her left, the bank of cameras mounted at the ceiling intervals. The cameras all had indicator lights, red lights when they were active. Every light in her line of sight was dark. She sat with that for exactly as long as she could afford to, then started the car and drove out. Her apartment was 12 minutes from the hospital on a day with no traffic. She made it in 10. She lived on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better management but had good bones, and she'd chosen it 2 years ago for the same reason she chose most things. Functional, unflashy, useful. She dropped the bag on the kitchen table and put the USB drive next to her laptop. She filled a glass of water and didn't drink it. She picked up her phone and called the state medical board's complaint line. She'd looked up the number once, the way she looked things up. Not because she needed it yet, but because it was useful to know. The line connected to a recorded message explaining the process for filing a formal complaint. She listened to the whole thing. She didn't leave a message. She called a colleague at Riverstone General, a travel nurse named Becca, who'd worked Northgate's ICU 2 years ago and left with her own set of opinions about how the place operated. Voicemail. She didn't leave a message on that one either. She opened the laptop. The files she'd copied were disorganized, the shorthand hard to follow even for her, but she started building a timeline on a blank document. Patient names, dates, timestamp discrepancies. The pattern she'd been half seeing for weeks was now visible in full, and it was worse than she'd let herself think in the car. Not 2 patients with altered documentation. Not 3. 7. Over 14 months. Complication codes that reduced reportable numbers. Timestamp signatures from physicians whose OR schedules made them impossible. Clearances on flags that should have stopped surgeries that proceeded anyway, and at least 2 deaths that the system had classified in ways that kept them off the adverse event reports that went to the state. Someone had been doing this long enough to get comfortable with it, long enough to have a system. She was still typing when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Not a spam pattern. No spam caller tries a single attempt at 10:40 on a Tuesday with a local area code she didn't recognize. She answered on the second buzz. Hart. Not a question, not a greeting, just her name, the way someone says a name when they already know it. She went still in the way she went still in parking garages and field triage points. Not frozen, not afraid, just completely, deliberately quiet. Who is this? A pause. Then, Sergeant Hart. Nobody had called her that in 4 years. Nobody outside of a specific and classified context had ever called her that in Silver Harbor. She'd built her civilian life specifically so that nobody would. We need to talk, the voice said. Calm, deliberate, male, mid-40s if she had to guess. Not on this line. Then tell me where. Another pause, shorter, like he'd expected the question and respected that she'd asked it without hesitation. He gave her a location, a cross street near the harbor. He gave her a time, 32 minutes from now. She looked at the timeline on her laptop screen. 7 patients, 14 months. A parking garage with cameras that had been turned off before she'd walked to her car. I'll be there, she said. The line went dead. She closed the laptop, pocketed the USB drive, and stood up. Her water glass was still full on the counter. She left it there. The cross street he'd given her was 4 blocks from the water, in the part of Silver Harbor where the harbor district stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. Old warehouses converted to cold storage, a fish processing plant that had been closed for 3 years but still smelled like it hadn't, a stretch of sidewalk that the city's redevelopment plans had been promising to address since Emily had moved here. She parked on the street rather than in the lot, out of habit, and walked the last half block with her hands in her jacket pockets and the USB drive between her fingers like a worry stone. There was a man standing at the corner. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, plain pants, Nothing that announced anything, but he stood the way people stood when they'd spent years in places where how you positioned yourself was a survival calculation. Back to the wall, clear line of sight in both directions. Weight distributed forward. Emily recognized the posture the way you recognized a dialect. She'd spoken it herself. He was maybe 45. Close-cropped hair going gray at the sides. A face that had spent time outdoors in conditions that weren't recreational. He watched her come toward him and didn't move until she was 6 feet away. "You came alone," he said. "You said not to bring the drive. I brought the drive." Something almost like a smile crossed his face and then left. "Smart. I didn't say that to test you." "I know, but I wasn't going to leave it in the car either." He extended a hand. "Garrett Voss, not the Darlene kind." "I know who you are." She didn't, not exactly, but she knew the category and she knew enough to know he wasn't a threat, at least not to her. "You said my rank. How?" "Took some digging. Not much, once you know where to look." He nodded toward a diner at mid-block, its windows fogged with the warmth of a place that had been open since 6 in the morning. "I'd rather not stand on a corner." Inside, the diner smelled like coffee and the particular brand of bacon grease that meant the ventilation had been losing the fight for decades. They took a booth at the back. The waitress came and Garrett ordered coffee without looking at the menu, and Emily ordered the same, and they waited until she left. "How much do you know about what's happening at Northgate?" Garrett asked. "As of 2 hours ago. I think there's a documentation falsification operation that's been running for over a year. Altered complication codes, backdated physician sign-offs, at least 2 patient deaths reclassified to stay off the adverse event reports." He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man confirming a coordinate he'd already plotted. 7 deaths, possibly 8. One of them is the reason I'm in Silver Harbor." Emily kept her face even. 7 she'd counted. 8 was a number she hadn't finished building yet. "Who?" "A man named Roy Callahan, 54, retired Army, 2 tours, Desert Shield, and the first Gulf Push. He came into Northgate 6 weeks ago for a vascular procedure." Garrett wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, but didn't drink from it. "He died during a complication that his family was told was unforeseeable. Except Roy had flagged concerns to 3 people before his surgery, in writing, and those concerns don't appear anywhere in his current chart. Pre-op flags. 3 of them, all cleared by a physician who, according to the OR schedule you probably already found, couldn't have been where the clearance says he was." "Dr. Lanford," Emily said. She hadn't said the name aloud before. She'd seen it 6 times in the files. Garrett looked at her across the table. "You're thorough." "I've had practice." She paused. "Roy Callahan. Was he connected to someone I should know about?" "He was connected to someone who's connected to people who asked questions, and eventually those questions reached a unit I still have ties to. It's not a clean pipeline. It took 6 weeks to get to me, and I've been in Silver Harbor for 4 days." 4 days? She thought about the locked supply closet on 3, the cameras in the parking garage. "Did you know about the suspension before tonight?" "I knew you'd been flagging irregularities. I didn't know they'd move this fast." The coffee came. Emily drank hers, and it was bad coffee, and she didn't care. "So what happens now?" "Now depends on what's on that drive." He nodded at her jacket pocket. "And on whether you're willing to work with people who have more access than you do, but less ground-level knowledge. Depends on who those people are." DOD, Inspector General's office. "Not formally. This isn't a formal investigation yet. It's a preliminary inquiry that becomes formal if we have enough to open one. We have a thread. We need what you found to make it a rope." Emily looked at him for a moment. The diner had 3 other occupied tables, and none of them were paying attention to the 2 people in the back booth, and she wanted to keep it that way. How did Northgate get to the point where this was possible for a year? Same way it always does. Small compromises that feel like reasonable adjustments. A complication code that saves a reporting headache. A flag that gets cleared because the surgery's already scheduled and rescheduling is expensive and the physician thinks it's probably fine. And then someone realizes there's a financial incentive behind some of those compromises, and the compromises stop being accidental. Who's the financial incentive? A contractor named Palladian Group. They hold Northgate's supply and equipment contracts, and they have a very specific interest in Northgate's adverse event numbers staying low, because those numbers affect the hospital's accreditation, which affects Palladian's contract renewals. Garrett finally drank his coffee. Marcus Slade sits on Palladian's advisory board. He has since before he took the VP role. Emily set her mug down. That was the shape of it. That was what she'd been feeling around the edges of without being able to name it. The reason the first person on scene after Walter Grimes crashed had been an administrator rather than a clinical supervisor. Slade hadn't arrived fast because he was efficient. He'd arrived fast because he had a reason to control the narrative before anyone else wrote it. "I need time to think about this," she said. "You have until tomorrow morning." He slid a card across the table. Plain cardstock, a number, no name. "If you're in, call that before 9. If you're not in, call it anyway and tell me, because the people who put that note on your windshield are going to escalate, and I'd rather you not be alone when they do." She took the card. "What kind of escalation?" "The kind that starts with threatening your nursing license and ends wherever they feel they need to take it." He stood, left a 10 on the table that more than covered both coffees. "You did good work in there today. The Grimes patient. He almost died. But he didn't." He looked at her without sentiment, just plain acknowledgement. "Get some sleep, Sergeant." He walked out. Emily sat in the diner for another 6 minutes, which was long enough to know no one had followed him in or was waiting outside for her. Old habit. She was full of old habits that had no business being relevant in a civilian life and were proving relevant anyway. She drove home, sat at her kitchen table with the laptop open, and stared at the timeline she'd been building until the words stopped making sense. Then she closed it and went to bed and didn't sleep well, but she slept, which was more than she'd expected. She called the number at 7:48 in the morning. "I'm in," she said, "but I have conditions." "Tell me." "Whatever you get from this doesn't leave Roy Callahan's family without answers. Whatever report gets filed, whatever charges get brought, those families know what happened to their people. That's not optional." A pause on the line. Not Garrett, a different voice, older, female, with the flat precision of someone who'd spent a career writing things that had legal weight. That's consistent with what a formal investigation would produce. "I didn't ask if it was consistent. I asked if it was a condition." Another pause. "Yes, it's a condition." "Then we have a starting point." Emily looked at the timeline on her screen. "I'm going to need to go back into Northgate." "We expected that. We're working on a mechanism. Give us 48 hours. What the mechanism turned out to be was elegant in a way that Emily hadn't anticipated. 43 hours later, she got a call from Patrice Moon. "The review panel has decided to extend your administrative leave pending a formal findings process," Patrice said, with the particular warmth of someone delivering bad news in a frame designed to make it sound neutral. "However, as part of that process, you have the right to access your own personnel file and any documentation that directly pertains to the incident in question." Emily let a beat go by. "And I can do that in person?" "You can come in tomorrow between 9 and 11. HR Suite. You'll be escorted." "Of course." She kept her voice exactly calibrated, slightly defeated, professionally compliant. "Thank you, Patrice." She ended the call and texted the number on the card. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. I'm in." The reply came back in under 2 minutes. "Don't go alone. Take your phone. Keep it recording the moment you enter the building." The HR suite at Northgate occupied the corner of the administrative floor that got the most morning light, which was the kind of detail that felt ironic when you were sitting in it under the circumstances Emily was sitting in it under. Patrice Moon had a large desk and very little on it, and she managed the space between herself and the people across from her with the skill of someone who had turned professional distance into an art form. Emily sat with her hands in her lap and her phone in her jacket pocket, running audio. She'd worn the jacket specifically because it had a chest pocket, which positioned the mic better. Old discipline again. "The review panel has identified several areas of concern regarding your actions on the day of the incident," Patrice began. "I'd like to see the documentation." "That's what we're here to." "The specific documentation, the written incident report that Dr. Hale filed, the nursing protocol checklist for the type of emergency involved, and the timestamp log for the rapid response team's arrival time. Emily kept her tone mild, curious even, the kind of nurse who wanted to understand the process. If the review is based on those, I should be able to see them. Patrice's professional warmth cooled by approximately 4 degrees. She opened a folder and slid 3 documents across the desk. Emily read them carefully. She took her time. She was reading the content, yes, but she was also reading what wasn't there. The gaps, the framings, the places where a document said nurse-initiated unsanctioned intervention when the clinical timeline would have shown that any intervention was initiated before a physician was physically present. She was also reading the timestamp on the rapid response log, which showed an arrival time of 11 minutes after the initial alarm. 11 minutes was not a good number. 11 minutes was the kind of number that raised questions about response readiness, about staffing, about whether the floor had been operating with the coverage it was supposed to have. This rapid response time, she said, 11 minutes. Response times vary depending on... The floor standard is 7. That's not a preference. It's an accreditation requirement. She set the document down. Is this accurate, or is this a reported time? Patrice Moon looked at her with an expression that had moved past professional distance into something more careful. The documentation reflects... I'm asking if the 11 minutes reflects when the team was called, or when the team arrived. I'm not able to speak to the granular, because those are different things, Emily said. She said it gently. And if the log is time of call rather than time of arrival, then the real response time was longer, which is a separate issue from anything involving me. The room was quiet enough that Emily could hear the ventilation system. Patrice looked down at her folder. She looked back up. I'll need to verify that with the facilities team, she said, and her voice had changed just slightly, thinned out in a way that meant she'd heard something she hadn't been prepared to hear. Emily nodded. Of course. I appreciate your time. She stood, thanked Patrice for the access, and walked out through the administrative corridor with the audio still running in her pocket. She was in the elevator when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that was different from Garrett's card. Shorter prefix, the same area code. They pulled your building access card records from the day of suspension. They know you used the records terminal. She had 30 seconds before the elevator reached the lobby. She typed back, "How current is this?" The reply came before the doors opened. "This morning. They're building a case for data theft. You have maybe 48 hours before they file." The elevator opened. She walked through the lobby and out through the main entrance and across the parking lot to her car, and she sat in it and she breathed through her nose for 4 seconds and out through her mouth for 4 seconds, and she did it twice. Then she called Garrett. "They're moving to file data theft charges," she said when he picked up. "I know. We've been watching the hospital's legal team's activity. They retained outside counsel yesterday. That's faster than I expected. They're scared. Scared people move fast and make mistakes. This is actually..." He paused. "This is consistent with what we need. If they file, it triggers a formal discovery process, which means anything they file becomes something we can respond to with what you found. They'd essentially be opening the door. That's a complicated door to want them to open." "It is, but right now it's the one we've got." A pause. "How much did you get in the HR meeting?" "Enough. The rapid response log has a time discrepancy I put on the record. Patrice Moon doesn't know what to do with it, which means she's going to check, which means the facilities team is going to have a conversation they weren't expecting." "Good. Keep the audio." Another pause, and she heard something in the background. Voices. The particular acoustic of a room with too many people in it moving with purpose. "Emily, I need to tell you something." She waited. Roy Callahan wasn't the only veteran. We've identified 3 others whose records went through Northgate in the past 14 months. All of them post-procedure complications. All of them reclassified. She closed her eyes. Opened them. Were they connected to anyone? Officially? One of them was a reservist who'd done a tour 18 months before his surgery. That's the one that created the paper trail that reached us. He let that settle. We're not the only people paying attention now. There are people above my level who are paying attention, which means the timeline is moving faster than I initially told you. How much faster? I'm expecting a federal signal within the next 72 hours. When that happens, the hospital won't have any warning. Neither will Slade. Emily looked at the entrance of Northgate through her windshield. The building looked the same as it had every morning she'd driven to it for 3 years. Same glass, same signage, same people moving through the automatic doors without looking at what they were walking into. What do I do until then? Stay visible. Don't disappear. If they think you're building a case, they'll assume going quiet means you're scared. Stay normal. Stay close to people who've seen you recently, and don't let them put anything else in writing with your name on it without having someone look at it first. That's a short leash. It's a careful one. There's a difference. She ended the call. She started her car but didn't drive anywhere yet. She was running through the timeline in her head. 7 patients, now 4 veterans among them, a contractor with financial stakes in the adverse event numbers, an administrator whose board position she hadn't known about until 40 hours ago, and a data theft filing that would be built on records that documented exactly the thing the hospital needed everyone to not notice. She thought about Roy Callahan, who had flagged 3 concerns in writing before a surgery he hadn't survived. She thought about what it meant to put something in writing and have it disappear. She put the car in drive. She went to see Walter Grimes. Not because it was smart or strategically useful. She'd spent long enough in her own head running the calculations, and she needed to do something that was just human. She stopped at the gift shop in the lobby and bought a card that said, "Get well" in simple text, not the kind with balloons and cartoons, and she took the elevator to his floor, and she told the nurse at the station that she was a friend from outside the hospital, which was close enough to true. He was awake. He looked better than he had 2 days ago, though better was relative. His color was still off, and there was a wariness in him that hadn't been there before his crash, the particular wariness of a body that now knew it could betray you. "You're the nurse from the other day," he said. Not accusing, just noting. "I am. I wanted to check in. They told me some nurse had flagged something before the incident. I figured it was you." He looked at her. "They also told me the nurse had been suspended." "That's accurate." He was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who weighed things before he said them. She could see it in the way he held his face when he was thinking. "That doesn't seem right," he said. "It is what it is." "Did you get in trouble because of me?" "No, I got in trouble because of things that were already there." She set the card on his bedside table. "How are they treating you now?" "Different doctor. The new one's actually explaining things." A pause. "The other one, Hale, he hasn't been back." "Good," she said, and meant it. "Make sure someone you trust is with you for any procedure discussions from here, even routine ones." He looked at her steadily. "Is there something I should be worried about?" She thought about what to say. She thought about Roy Callahan, who had flagged 3 concerns in writing. "Just ask questions," she said, "and write them down." She left his room and took the elevator down and walked out through the lobby, and she didn't look at the administrative floor windows, even though she had the feeling, animal and nonspecific, that someone up there was watching the parking lot. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the USB drive and the laptop, and she did something she probably shouldn't have done alone, but did. Anyway, she built a second copy of everything, organized and annotated, and she sent it to an email address that Garrett had given her on a piece of paper he'd then taken back from her because she'd had 20 seconds to memorize it. She was reasonably confident she'd gotten all 9 digits of the address correct. She sent it and got no bounce-back error, which she chose to interpret as confirmation. Then she made herself eat something, toast, which was what she had, and she wasn't hungry, but she ate it anyway because falling apart was a luxury she couldn't currently afford. She thought about calling her sister in Portland and decided against it. There was no version of that conversation that didn't make things worse for both of them, and she'd learned a long time ago to keep the people she loved out of the blast radius until she knew the size of the blast. She was washing her plate when her phone rang. Not the unknown number, not Garrett's card number, her regular number, the one on her contact sheet at Northgate, the one that Patrice Moon had. It was Tomas Reyes. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Hey," he said. He sounded like someone who'd been working himself up to making a call for several hours. "I know you probably don't want to hear from anyone from the hospital right now." "It's fine," she said. "What is it?" A pause. I don't know if I should be saying this. Then say it and let me decide. Another pause, longer. There was a meeting today, after you left the HR suite. I don't know how I ended up in the hallway at the right time, but I did. Slade and someone I didn't recognize going into the conference room, and I heard... He stopped. Slade said something about making sure the licensing board understood the full picture. Those exact words. The full picture. Like he was planning what to tell them. Emily kept her breathing even. Did you see the other person's face? Briefly, older guy, suit, not hospital staff, outside counsel. Tomas, I need you to not repeat this to anyone else. Not Darlene, not anyone on your unit, not in writing anywhere. Can you do that? I'm already not doing that. That's why I called you directly. A pause. Are you okay? It was a more complicated question than he probably knew. I'm managing, she said. Thank you for calling. She ended the call and stood in her kitchen and thought about the word managing, which was the truest thing she'd said to anyone in 2 days. She was managing. She was managing the information and the access and the timeline and the particular quality of controlled stillness that she'd learned in places where going still was the difference between completing the mission and not completing it. She put her phone on the table and looked at the wall. 48 hours, Garrett had said. 72 for the federal signal. She was 30 hours into the first window and 12 hours into the second. She was still doing the math when her phone rang again, and this time it was the number from the card, and Garrett's voice had a texture in it that she hadn't heard the day before. Something close to urgency, close enough that she recognized it before he said a word. Turn on the local news, he said. She didn't have a TV. She opened her laptop and pulled up the Silver Harbor Courier's live stream. The headline was already running across the bottom of the screen. Northgate Medical Center Executive Senator McCallum transferred to Northgate. Condition undisclosed. Senator Diane McCallum, 61. 3 terms. Chair of the State Senate Health and Human Services Committee. The committee that oversaw hospital accreditation standards. She came in through the ER 40 minutes ago, Garrett said. Cardiac event. They've got her in the ICU. Emily looked at the screen. She thought about the documentation she'd found. The altered codes. The falsified clearances. The 7 deaths that had been reclassified and smoothed over and kept off the reports that went to the state. The reports that went to the committee that Diane McCallum chaired. If something happens to her in that hospital, Emily started. I know. The investigation gets buried. The committee chair dies at the hospital under review, and the whole thing becomes about her death, not about what was already happening. Or, Garrett said, and his voice had moved past urgency into something more deliberate, it becomes the event that makes everything impossible to ignore, but only if we move before they can shape what it looks like. A pause. Emily, I need to know if you can get back into that building tonight. She looked at the clock on her laptop. It was 9:47 p.m. I don't have access, she said. We know someone who can get you in, but you'd have to be there in 20 minutes, and you'd have 15 minutes inside before anyone notices an anomaly in the access log. She was already closing the laptop. What am I looking for? McCallum's chart, whatever they're entering tonight. If they're going to run the same playbook they used on the others, they'll start adjusting documentation within the first few hours. We need a time-stamped capture of what's in the system before the adjustments happen. And if they've already started, then we need that too. His voice leveled. This is the part where I have to tell you that if you're caught inside that building tonight, the data theft filing becomes something significantly harder to fight. I know. You don't have to do this. Emily picked up her jacket and her keys. The USB drive went into her pocket. 20 minutes, she said. Where's the contact? There was a pause, and in it she could hear him making a decision he'd probably already made, just confirming it was the right one. East service entrance. The person will be wearing a gray jacket, and they won't ask for your name. Good, she said. Neither will I. She was in her car before she finished the call. The streets at this hour were quiet in the way Silver Harbor got quiet. Not empty, just muted, the harbor lights reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier rain she'd barely noticed while she was sitting inside building a case that had just become something bigger and more dangerous than it had been that morning. She drove without music, without narration, without anything between her and the road. She was calculating, planning, running the 15 minutes in her head like a route she'd need to walk without a map. She was 3 blocks from Northgate when the emergency broadcast alert hit every phone in the city simultaneously. A sound she'd heard before only in drills and once in a situation that had nothing to do with a hospital in a mid-sized American city. She looked at the screen at a red light. Federal Emergency Declaration, Northgate Medical Center. All non-essential personnel ordered to vacate perimeter. The light turned green. She didn't move for 2 seconds, long enough for the car behind her to tap its horn. Then she drove forward because stopping was not something she was going to do. Her phone rang. Garrett. She answered on speaker. The timeline moved, he said, and his voice now had no texture left at all. Just flat, clean, operational. Federal declaration was triggered 40 minutes ago. There's a response team inbound. What kind of response? Military medical? DOD deployed an emergency field unit when McCallum's condition escalated. A pause, and in the pause she heard it before he said it. Heard it in the silence and the background noise and the particular way he was breathing. They're landing on the hospital's north pad in 11 minutes. She turned the corner and Northgate came into view 2 blocks ahead, lit up, personnel moving, the beginning of a perimeter starting to form along the sidewalk. And above the roofline, from the north, the sound she'd heard in other contexts and never forgotten, the specific harmonic of military helicopter rotors, the kind of aircraft that didn't land on hospital pads in civilian emergencies unless someone had decided the situation was no longer civilian. I'm 2 blocks out, she said. I know. Emily, his voice shifted, something in it she hadn't heard from him before. The unit commander, you know him. She slowed the car. The name, she said, Colonel James Wakefield, 3rd Special Medical Group. A pause. He put your name in the unit commendation report 8 years ago, the one that stayed classified. Emily pulled to the curb and stopped the car. She looked at the lights of Northgate Medical Center through the windshield. She looked at the airspace above it, where the navigation lights of an inbound aircraft were now visible against the dark. Wakefield. She hadn't said that name in 8 years. She hadn't needed to. She had moved to Silver Harbor and built a life that didn't require that name or the weight that came with it. He doesn't know I'm here? She asked. He didn't, as of 30 minutes ago. A pause. He does now. The aircraft descended toward the north pad, and even 2 blocks away she could see the wash from the rotors moving through the emergency lights at the perimeter's edge. Figures in the organized motion of a military medical unit establishing its footprint in a space it had claimed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Garrett's number, but the message wasn't Garrett's cadence. Hart, East Entrance, 2 minutes. W. She looked at the message for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she put the car in drive. The East Service entrance was a heavy steel door that opened onto a loading corridor used for linen and supply deliveries, and it was propped open by exactly 2 inches when Emily reached it. Enough to grab, not enough to be visible from the parking lot. She pulled it and went through, and the door sealed behind her with a sound like a decision being made. The corridor was lit by emergency strip lighting, the regular overheads on a reduced circuit because of the federal declaration, which meant the cameras on this wing were drawing from the backup power allocation, and 2 of the 3 she knew about were currently dark. The 3rd was at the corridor's end, and she walked past it without hesitating because hesitation was the thing cameras actually caught. Not your face, but the quality of your movement. She took the stairwell to the 2nd floor. Wakefield was waiting at the landing. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she'd remembered wrong. It had been 8 years, and memory compressed some things and expanded others, and she'd been 23 the last time she'd stood in proximity to James Wakefield, and she'd been a different person in almost every way except the ones that counted. He was 50 now, maybe 51, silver at the temples, the kind of build that came from decades of maintenance rather than vanity. He was in uniform. The rank on his collar was colonel, and it had been major when she'd last seen it. He looked at her for a long moment. "You look terrible," he said. I've been suspended and threatened with data theft charges in the last 48 hours. That tracks. He turned and walked, and she fell in beside him, which was a muscle memory she hadn't known she still had. I've been briefed on the investigation. Garrett's people forwarded me the documentation package. All of it? Enough to understand the shape of it. He pushed through a door into a corridor she recognized. Administrative wing, second floor, the section that connected to the clinical records office. McCallum's condition is serious. She came in with a type A dissection, which is survivable with immediate surgical intervention. She needs to be in an OR in the next 2 hours. Then why isn't she? He stopped walking. Because the surgical team that was prepped for the procedure includes Dr. Hale, and my medical staff reviewed his last 4 emergency surgeries in the past year and found complication rates that are statistically improbable, the kind that suggest either extraordinary bad luck or documentation that's been adjusted after the fact. 3 of the 4 patients had their intraoperative notes amended between 6 and 14 hours post-procedure. My people flagged it in 40 minutes because they were looking for it. Northgate's oversight missed it for 14 months because they weren't. Emily looked at him. You can't let Hale operate on her. I'm not going to. My surgical team is taking primary, but that's created a situation. He started walking again, and she stayed with him. Slade tried to invoke hospital authority to block our team from assuming clinical control. He's currently being told by 3 different lawyers that the federal emergency declaration supersedes his objection, but he's burning time we don't have, and every minute McCallum is not in surgery is a minute the dissection can extend. What do you need from me? He pushed through another door, and they were in the clinical records office, a room with a long bank of terminals and no one in it, which told her he'd cleared it somehow. He sat at the nearest terminal and typed a credential string from memory. McCallum's current chart has a pre-surgical assessment filed 40 minutes ago by Dr. Lanford. I need you to look at it and tell me what you see. She sat down at the adjacent terminal. Wakefield pulled up the chart on his screen and angled it toward her, and she read it the way she'd read 100 charts, fast, in layers, the narrative first, and then the data underneath the narrative. It took her 90 seconds. Lanford documented a contraindication for emergency surgical intervention, she said. Yes. Based on a blood thinner medication in her current protocol. Yes. She's not on that medication. It's not in her medication history, her admission paperwork, or her ER intake form. Emily pointed at the screen without touching it. He added a contraindication to a medication she's not taking, which would complicate the consent process for emergency surgery and buy time. That's what my team concluded. Wakefield looked at her. I need a nursing witness who can attest to the discrepancy in the medication record, someone with direct knowledge of how Northgate's documentation system works, who can explain to a federal medical officer exactly what they're looking at and why it's wrong. That's me. That's you. He held her gaze. It also puts you directly in the middle of a federal medical proceeding, which gives the hospital's outside counsel a very specific target. Slade's counsel is already building a data theft case. I'm already a target. Being a target in a licensing complaint and being a target in a federal proceeding are 2 different weights. I know. She looked at the chart on the screen, the false contraindication, the clean, careful timestamp, the name Lanford at the bottom in the attending field. Roy Callahan flagged 3 things in writing before his surgery, and none of them made it into his chart. McCallum is about to die from a condition that's treatable because someone added a medication to her record that she's not taking. She pushed back from the terminal. I'll testify to whatever I need to testify to. Let's go. The next 40 minutes operated on a logic that Emily recognized from a context she'd tried to leave behind. The particular compression of time that happened when multiple things needed to occur in a specific sequence, and none of them could wait for the others to finish. Wakefield's team had established a command point in the hospital's second-floor conference room, which they'd converted with a speed and economy that impressed her and reminded her, uncomfortably, how good at this they all were. She gave her statement to a federal medical officer named Captain Renata Souza, 30s, direct, the kind of precision that came from having no interest in anything that wasn't relevant. Emily walked her through the medication record discrepancy, the mechanism of Northgate's documentation system that allowed retroactive amendments, and the 3 other charts she'd documented in which the same pattern appeared. Souza typed without looking at the keyboard and asked 3 follow-up questions, all of which were the exact right 3 questions. At the end of it, Souza looked at her notes. You copied these records during a window when your credentials were still active. Yes. The hospital's position is that constitutes unauthorized data access. My credentials were active. The access was logged under my ID. The records I copied are records I had legitimate clinical access to in my role. Emily kept her voice level. The hospital's position is that I shouldn't have noticed what I noticed. Souza looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to her notes without responding, which was itself a kind of response. Wakefield returned from somewhere with a look on his face that she'd learned to read in other rooms, the look of a situation that was moving correctly but at a cost. Surgical consent is proceeding. My team goes in within 20 minutes. Slade has stopped fighting the clinical question and moved to fighting the investigative authority, which is slower and less immediately dangerous. What does that mean for the documentation case? It means he's trying to limit what we can access while we're operating under the emergency declaration. He's arguing our authority extends to McCallum's treatment, but not to a broader review of Northgate's records. That's wrong. It's wrong, and the legal team will establish that, but it'll take hours we don't necessarily have before he gets a judge to issue a temporary limitation. He looked at her. The documentation you already have, the copies on your drive, exists independent of what we can access tonight. That's the foundation. But if he gets a limitation order before we can pull the institutional records, we lose the comparison layer. We can't show the pattern without the originals. Emily thought about the timeline she'd built. 7 patients. The same fingerprints on each one. Lanford's sign-offs, the amended timestamps, the reclassification codes that kept things off the adverse event reports. Where are the original records stored? Server room on the 4th floor. Physical access is card-gated, but we have authority to access it under the declaration. The problem is, he paused. There's someone already in there. She looked at him. Building security flagged an access event 9 minutes ago. Card used was Slade's credentials, but Slade is currently in a conference room with 2 of our lawyers, which means someone is using his credentials, or someone with his credentials is a different person than we thought. Wakefield looked at her with the particular directness of someone who was about to ask something they'd prefer not to need to ask. My people are 2 minutes out. If someone is in that server room actively altering or deleting records, I'm faster, she said. I know the building. Emily. 2 minutes is 2 minutes. She was already moving. Tell your people I'm heading up the east stairwell. He said something behind her that she didn't catch, or chose not to. She took the stairwell at a pace that was not a run, but was not far from it, the kind of controlled speed that didn't announce itself. And she was on the 4th floor in 40 seconds. The server room was at the corridor's far end, behind a door that required a card and a 4-digit PIN. The card reader was showing a green light, which meant someone had authenticated in the last 10 minutes and the door was in a secondary open state, not physically open, but not requiring re-authentication for 30 minutes. She pressed the handle and it gave. She pushed through. The server room was cold in the way server rooms always were, climate-controlled to a temperature that was about the machines and not the humans, and it was lit by the ambient glow of status lights and one overhead fluorescent that buzzed faintly at a frequency that set her teeth together. The terminals were along the left wall, and 2 of them were active, their screens showing database access windows. Standing at the rightmost terminal was a woman Emily recognized, Darlene Voss. Not Slade, not outside counsel. Darlene Voss, charge nurse, 16 years on the surgical floor, who had watched Emily be escorted out with visible satisfaction and who was now standing in front of a hospital records terminal at 10:47 at night, using an administrator's credentials with her hands moving fast across the keyboard. She turned when she heard the door and something happened to her face. Not quite fear, because Darlene Voss was not someone who frightened easily, but something that rearranged itself rapidly into the expression of someone calculating odds. "You're not supposed to be in this building," Darlene said. "Neither are you. That's Slade's credential." Emily looked at the screen. The database window showed a batch file operation, multiple records being flagged for archival, which in Northgate's system was the first step in a record suppression sequence. "Stop what you're doing." I work here. Not at 11 p.m. in the server room with a VP's login, step back from the terminal. Darlene didn't step back. She looked at Emily with the full weight of 16 years of institutional seniority and the particular contempt of someone who has always been certain about which of them mattered more. You've been suspended. You have no authority to tell me anything. I have a federal emergency declaration and a military medical unit on the floor below us who have authority over everything in this building right now. Step back. A flicker. The calculation shifting. Darlene's hands, Emily noticed, had not left the keyboard. Darlene, Emily kept her voice even. I can see the batch operation on that screen. If you execute it, whatever you're suppressing becomes evidence of suppression rather than just records. You make it worse. I don't know what you think you're looking at. I'm looking at a charge nurse who's been the primary access point for every chart amendment in the past 14 months. Lanford signed off on them, but the amendment timestamps trace back to nursing station terminals. Your station, specifically, on 11 of the 14 incidents I've documented. Emily took a step toward her. You're not protecting Slade. You're protecting yourself. Darlene's jaw tightened. How long have you known what was happening to those patients? Emily asked, and she kept her voice clean of judgment, which was harder than it sounded, because she felt the judgment, she felt it clearly, but she needed the answer more than she needed to express the feeling. Something moved through Darlene's face. You think you understand this? Tell me what I'm missing. Lanford told me the flags were administrative overcautions. That's what he said. Every time. Her voice had changed. Not softer, but altered. The surface confidence thinning over something that had been sitting underneath it for a long time. He's an attending. I'm a charge nurse. When an attending tells you something is an administrative overcaution, you don't have the standing to... 7 people died, Darlene. The silence in the server room had a specific quality. The hum of machines keeping records, the fluorescent buzz, and the sound of 2 people who had worked the same floor for 3 years standing on opposite sides of something that could not be undone. Step back from the terminal, Emily said. Darlene stepped back. Emily moved to the keyboard. The batch operation was staged but not executed. 37 records in the queue, ranging from 14 months ago to 2 weeks prior. She closed the operation window without confirming it. The records stayed. She heard the door open behind her and turned to find 2 members of Wakefield's team in the doorway. Not running, just present, the way well-trained people were present when they arrived somewhere to make sure something didn't get worse. She needs to be detained, Emily said. And the terminal needs to be secured. One of them moved toward Darlene. The other pulled out a phone and started photographing the screens. Darlene was looking at Emily with an expression that Emily couldn't quite name. Not quite hatred, not quite relief. Somewhere in the space between them where things went when they'd been held too long and were finally being put down. You should have stayed in your lane, Darlene said. Emily looked at her. Roy Callahan wrote down 3 concerns before his surgery. Did you clear those flags? Darlene looked away. Did you clear them? Nothing. Emily let it go. She didn't have to hear it. It was in the record she'd just kept from being buried, and it would come out in a process that was now, finally, larger than what any one person in this building could control. She stepped out of the server room into the corridor and leaned against the wall for a moment that she allowed herself because she'd earned it, one hand flat against the painted concrete and her breathing deliberate and her mind running ahead to what came next. Her phone buzzed. Garrett. Server room? He said. Secured. Darlene Voss was running a batch suppression. 37 records. We stopped it before execution. A pause in which she could almost hear him absorbing that. The name, the scope, the particular shape of a betrayal that had been hiding inside the ordinary. That changes the picture. I know. Slade's outside counsel is withdrawing. Just happened. We think they got a look at the full evidentiary scope and made a calculation about where this goes. Another pause. Emily. Lanford just left the building. He walked out the main entrance 4 minutes ago with a bag. She straightened away from the wall. We have people outside. He's not going anywhere meaningful, but he walked, which means he knows the window is closing and he's made a choice. Garrett's voice was level, but she could hear what was under it. If he gets to someone before we get to him, he won't. You sound very certain. He flagged his own guilt when he walked. She moved down the corridor toward the stairwell. People who are actually innocent of something don't walk out of a building carrying a bag when there's a federal emergency declaration in effect. They go toward the authority, not away from it. He just told everyone exactly what he knows. A brief pause. That's Garrett. Is Wakefield still on the second floor? As far as I know. Tell him Lanford walked. He'll understand what that means for the surgical proceeding and the witness list. She took the stairs down. On the second floor landing, she paused because she heard voices from behind the door. Raised, or not raised exactly, but pressurized, the quality of a conversation where someone was running out of moves and knew it. She opened the door. The corridor outside the conference room that Wakefield's team had commandeered was crowded in a way it hadn't been 40 minutes ago. More of Wakefield's people. 2 people in suits she didn't recognize who had the specific quality of federal agents, and Marcus Slade, standing in the middle of it without his jacket, which was the most undone she'd ever seen him look. He was talking to one of the suits, or he had been talking. When Emily came through the stairwell door, he stopped. He looked at her with an expression that moved through several things very quickly. Surprise that she was in the building, calculation about what that meant, and then something that landed and stayed, which was the realization that she'd been in the building long enough to have done damage he could no longer estimate the size of. "You're going to lose your license," he said, not threatening exactly, more like a man saying a prayer he no longer believed in. "Mr. Slade," one of the suited figures touched his arm. "We need to continue this conversation inside." Slade didn't move immediately. He kept looking at Emily with the expression of a man watching something he'd built fall in a direction he hadn't planned for. "Those families are going to know what happened," Emily said. She said it quietly. Not for the hallway. For him. Roy Callahan's family, Patricia Keene's family, all of them. They're going to know. Something in his face moved. She couldn't tell what it was, and she didn't need to. She stepped to the side and let the suited figure guide him into the conference room, and the door closed, and she stood in the corridor and thought about nothing for approximately 4 seconds, which was all she could afford. Then Wakefield was beside her, appearing from wherever he'd been in the way he'd always had of arriving without making an entrance. "McCallum is in surgery," he said. "My team lead says 2 hours, possibly less. She has a real chance." "Good." Lanford's been stopped at the north parking exit. He had a flash drive in his jacket pocket. Wakefield looked at her. "We'll need to know what's on it." "I can tell you what's on it." "I know you can." He studied her for a moment with the kind of directness that didn't perform itself. "You did good work tonight. People died." "Yes. And without what you did, more would have." He let that sit. "There's going to be a process from here. Formal statements, Federal Review Board. The licensing complaint gets absorbed into the larger proceeding. It won't be fast." "I know how process works." "You'll need a lawyer." "I know that too." He nodded. He looked down the corridor toward the conference room where Slade was now sitting with federal agents, and she suspected having the worst conversation of his professional life. "I should have found you sooner," Wakefield said. "When you left the service, I should have... You didn't know I was here. I should have known." She looked at him. There was something in his voice that was adjacent to guilt, the kind that had been sitting somewhere for 8 years, and she understood it, and she didn't have the capacity right now to fully receive it. "We'll talk about that later," she said. "When it's over." "When it's over," he agreed. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and looked at the screen, and the number wasn't Garrett, and it wasn't a saved contact. She looked at it for a moment, something pulling at the back of her mind, a recognition she couldn't quite surface. She answered. The voice on the other end was young, mid-20s, male, clipped with something that was trying to sound like control and wasn't quite there. "Is this Emily Hart?" "It is." "My name is Danny Callahan. Roy Callahan was my father." A breath, unsteady. "Someone told me you were there tonight, that you stopped something." She looked at Wakefield and then looked away, at the wall, at the lit corridor of a hospital that was in the process of being turned inside out. Her throat did something she managed. "I'm here," she said. "Can you tell me?" His voice broke partway through the word, and he stopped and started again. "Can you tell me what happened to him? What actually happened?" Emily closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Yes," she said. "I can tell you. Everything." She started to walk toward the window at the corridor's end, where the harbor lights were visible through the glass, and the north pad was still lit, and the night was fully committed to what it had become. She was 4 steps from the window when the building's main power dropped. Not the emergency strips. Those stayed on, casting the corridor in the reduced amber of backup lighting. The full hospital grid, the overheads, the terminal screens, the elevator indicators, all of it gone in a single cut that had the specific character of something that had not malfunctioned, something that had been switched. "Danny," she said into the phone, "I need to call you back." She ended the call. The corridor was amber and shadow, and the sound of the hospital changing its character. Alarms that had been running on primary power shifting to backup frequencies, the elevator system locking down, the distinct sound from somewhere below of people reacting to an unexpected darkness. Wakefield appeared at her shoulder. "That was deliberate," she said. "Yes." "The server room? My people are still in there, battery backup on the servers." He was already moving. "But if someone cut primary power, they had access to the building's electrical systems, which means they had time we didn't account for. Who else knew the layout?" "Facilities staff. Anyone with building access above a certain clearance level." He was moving fast now, and she was with him. "There's one person on the facilities team who Slade hired directly 18 months ago. We flagged the hire this morning, and we were building toward questioning him." She heard something from the stairwell ahead, 1 floor down, the sound of a door opening, and then, very briefly, of something that might have been footsteps moving in a direction away from where everything was concentrated. "East stairwell," she said. "My people are on the 2nd floor and the 4th floor. The east stairwell exits to the service corridor." She was already at the door. "The same one I came in through." Wakefield grabbed her arm. "Not hard. Just present, just enough. You are not chasing someone through a dark stairwell alone." "I'm not chasing anyone." She looked at him. "I know where the service corridor exits. There's only one door to the outside, and it locks from inside only." She held his gaze. "He's not leaving through the front, and if he reaches that door before your people reach the perimeter..." Wakefield let go of her arm and spoke into the radio on his collar, clipped and specific, the kind of instruction that people who knew what they were doing responded to without asking questions. 30 seconds, he said to her. "Then we go together." The backup lighting hummed in the corridor, and somewhere below them a door opened or closed, and the building held everything in it. The records that hadn't been deleted, the senator in surgery, the charge nurse in federal custody, the administrator in a conference room with agents, and in a service corridor 1 floor below, in the amber of emergency lighting, something that was not yet over. Her phone buzzed 1 more time. Text from an unknown number she'd never seen before. 5 words. He already copied everything. "Drive." She showed Wakefield the text. He read it once and didn't say anything for 2 seconds, which was his version of a reaction. "The drive Lanford had when they stopped him," Emily said. "We assumed it was records he was taking out." Wakefield was already moving, radio at his collar again. If it's a copy of something he already sent, then stopping him at the parking exit didn't stop anything. She walked with him fast. "Who sent this text?" "I don't know." "Is it someone on your side?" "It might be someone on no one's side who wants to make sure we know." He spoke into the radio, a crisp instruction to whoever was holding Lanford to secure the drive immediately and isolate him from any outgoing communication. Then he looked at her. "Or it could be designed to pull our attention to the drive while something else moves. Either way, we need to know what's on it." "Either way," he agreed. They found Lanford in the back of a government vehicle in the north lot, which she could see through the glass doors at the corridor's end. The vehicle's interior light on, 2 people standing outside it. He'd been cooperative, according to the agent Wakefield reached by radio, which was the kind of cooperative that meant a man who'd calculated his options and decided that cooperation was the best remaining one. The flash drive was in an evidence bag. The agent read off the file count, 43 files, mixed formats, pulled from Northgate's clinical database. More than what was in the batch queue upstairs, Emily said. He'd been building this longer than tonight. Wakefield looked at the vehicle through the glass. He was either building a case or building a bargaining chip, possibly both. If it's a bargaining chip, he was planning to use it before we got here. Yes. Which means he knew we were coming. She thought about the timeline. Garrett's 4 days in Silver Harbor, the preliminary inquiry, the federal signal that had moved faster than expected. Someone in the information chain had been less secure than it appeared. Who knew about the DOD inquiry before tonight? My team, Garrett's contact at the IG's office, and whoever they reported to. He paused, just briefly. And whoever those people talked to. You have a leak. I have a possibility of a leak. He said it with the precision of someone who'd learned not to confirm things before he had to. Orlanford is more observant than we gave him credit for, and he noticed 4 days ago that something had changed in how the hospital was being watched. It was possible. Emily had been observant enough to notice that the cameras in the parking garage had been turned off before she'd walked to her car. Someone who'd been gaming a documentation system for 14 months wasn't doing it without paying attention to their environment. What's on the drive changes the picture either way, she said. If he built it as a bargaining chip, he included things that implicate him, but also things that implicate everyone above him. That's how a bargaining chip works. You don't trade something that only hurts you. Wakefield looked at her with the expression of a man who was thinking what she was thinking. Slade, he said, and whoever Slade answers to at Palladian Group. The drive was accessed in the mobile command unit that Wakefield's team had set up in the north lot, a vehicle that looked like an oversized passenger van from the outside and contained more processing power and secure communication bandwidth than most regional field offices. Emily sat at a fold-down table across from a tech specialist named Huang, who had the energy of someone for whom a high-stakes midnight records review was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, which for him it might have been. The files loaded. Huang sorted them by creation date, and Emily started reading from the oldest, which was 14 months ago, and the picture that assembled itself over the next 35 minutes was both worse and more coherent than what she'd built from her own copies. Lanford had kept records, not because he was conscientious, nothing in his history suggested conscientiousness, but because he was protecting himself. He documented every instance in which he'd been asked to clear a pre-surgical flag that he hadn't personally reviewed. Every instance in which the instruction had come not from clinical judgment, but from an email, a conversation, a text message that he'd screenshotted and saved. The instruction source was consistent, a woman named Vera Aldrich, Northgate's director of clinical compliance, who reported directly to Slade. Vera Aldrich had a name Emily recognized from the organizational chart, but a face she couldn't place because the director of clinical compliance was not someone who appeared on nursing floors. She sat in the administrative suite and produced reports and managed accreditation documentation, and apparently had been the operational center of a scheme that had run for 14 months and killed 8 people. Aldrich, Emily said. Huang looked at the file she was pointing to. She's in the building? I don't know. She looked at Wakefield, who had been reading over her shoulder for the last 10 minutes. Is she in the building? He spoke into the radio. Waited. She badged in at 7 p.m., no badge out recorded. 7 p.m. was before the federal declaration, before the emergency, before anyone had any reason to know what tonight was going to become. She came in early, Emily said, before the declaration. She was here when McCallum arrived. Wakefield's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. She knew McCallum was coming. Or she knew something was going to happen that she needed to be present for. Emily looked at the files on the screen. The false contraindication in McCallum's chart. Lanford signed it, but if the pattern holds, it came from Aldrich, Wakefield said, and Aldrich is still in the building. He was on the radio before she finished the sentence. Pocket. They found Vera Aldrich in the clinical compliance office on the 3rd floor, which was exactly where she was supposed to be, sitting at her desk with her computer open and a cup of coffee that had gone cold at her elbow. She was 53 and had the particular quality of stillness that people developed when they decided, sometime in the last hour, to stop running and wait for what was coming. She looked at Emily when they came through the door, not at Wakefield, not at the two agents behind him. She looked at Emily with the focused attention of someone who had wanted to put a face to a name. "You're the nurse," she said. "I am. I've been reading your nursing notes for 2 years." Her voice was flat, not hostile. Exhausted, maybe. "You flag more anomalies than anyone else on that floor. I used to have Lanford review your charts specifically, to see what I'd noticed, to make sure what you'd noticed wasn't going anywhere." She looked down at her keyboard. "For 2 years it didn't." "Vera Aldrich." Wakefield moved into her line of sight. "We need you to step away from the terminal." She stepped away. She didn't reach for anything, didn't make any motion that wasn't cooperative. She picked up the cold coffee and then set it back down. "I want to talk to someone," she said. "Not a lawyer. I want to talk to someone who has the authority to make an agreement." "That's not a conversation that happens at midnight in your office," one of the agents said. "I know." She looked at Emily again. "The senator. Is she going to be all right?" Emily said nothing. "The contraindication in her chart, Lanford didn't fabricate it alone. I told him what to enter." She said it without drama, without apparent emotion, the way someone states a fact they've been holding for long enough that the weight of it has become familiar. "I need you to know that I also have documentation, not to bargain, because those families deserve to know that the people who did this aren't going to claim they only followed instructions." The room was quiet except for the building settling around them and the distant sound of the hospital's shifted electrical load. "Where's the documentation?" Wakefield asked. She reached into the desk drawer slowly, visibly, making every movement readable. She placed a sealed envelope on the desk. "I've been carrying this for 3 months. I kept thinking I'd find a reason not to need it." One of the agents bagged it without opening it. Aldrich looked at Emily. "Slade told us the Palladian metrics required adverse event numbers below a specific threshold. He made it sounded like chart management. Like the flags were overcautious and the reclassifications were a correction, not a fabrication." She stopped. "I knew by month 4 that it wasn't. I kept going anyway. That's the part I can't—" She stopped again. Emily didn't fill the silence. She understood the impulse to fill it, and she didn't. "Slade," she said. "Did he know what the reclassifications were doing to real patients?" Slade knew everything. There was no hesitation in it. He knew, and he managed it, and he never used his own name on anything. Slade was still in the conference room on the 2nd floor when they brought Aldrich's envelope down. Emily watched through the glass panel in the door. She wasn't in the room and didn't need to be, but she could see the shift that happened when the envelope was placed on the table in front of his lawyers. The outside counsel picked it up, read the cover note, set it down. They asked for a recess. The agent running the room said no. The agent said something else that Emily couldn't hear, and Slade, sitting across the table in his expensive shirt with his jacket still off, looked at the envelope and then looked away. And in the angle of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, she could see the exact moment a man stops believing there's a version of this where he walks out the way he came in. She moved away from the door. Garrett was in the corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, which she'd come to recognize as the posture he adopted when things were moving correctly, but at a speed that required patience he was running low on. He looked at her when she came away from the door. "Aldrich gave them 3 months of internal communications," he said, "including a meeting summary from a Palladian Group quarterly review where Slade presented the adverse event numbers as a managed outcome. With slides. With slides? PowerPoint, labeled, distributed to 6 Palladian board members." He shook his head, not in disbelief exactly, but in the particular weariness of someone who'd seen enough of human nature to not be surprised by it and was tired of not being surprised. He presented dead patients as a performance metric. Emily leaned against the opposite wall. The corridor was amber and humming, and the hospital around them was operating on its backup logic. Essential systems, reduced staff, the particular focused quiet of an institution in crisis management. "The families," she said. "Roy Callahan's son called me tonight." "I know. We'll set up a formal notification process. You don't have to be the one to carry that." "I told him I'd tell him everything." She looked at Garrett. I meant it. I know you did. He wasn't dismissing it. He was just being honest about the bureaucracy that would surround what came next, the way well-meaning bureaucracy always did. It'll happen. It just won't happen tonight. She accepted that. She didn't like it, but she accepted it, which was different. Down the corridor, the conference room door opened. The outside counsel came out first. Two of them, in the particular motion of people who had just made a professional calculation, and they walked toward the elevator without looking back. Slade's lawyers. Not Slade. They were leaving without their client, which was a statement that required no translation. A moment later, the lead agent appeared in the doorway. She looked at Garrett and gave him a small nod. Garrett pushed off the wall. Emily watched Marcus Slade come out of the conference room with an agent on each side of him. He wasn't cuffed. Not yet. Not in a hospital corridor. But the quality of the space around him had changed. The way space changed around people when it stopped belonging to them. He was still wearing his expensive shirt and his lanyard, and he had the face of a man who'd spent 20 years being the person who controlled the room and was now in a room he could not control. He saw her. He stopped walking for exactly one step, which was the one step the agents allowed before they moved him forward again. She didn't say anything. She'd said what she had to say in this corridor already, and there was nothing she needed from him now. She just looked at him, which was enough, because the looking said everything the words would have said, and it cost her nothing. He looked away first. She watched them take him toward the elevator. She watched the doors close. She stood in the corridor with the amber backup lighting and the sound of the hospital doing its essential work, and she felt something shift in her chest that was not satisfaction exactly. It was too complicated for that. Too mixed with the faces she'd never met and the names in the files she'd spent 2 days building a case around. It was more like a door closing, the right door, finally, closing. Her phone buzzed. Tomas. She answered. I saw them bring someone out through the lobby, he said. He was whispering, which meant he was still somewhere in the building, which surprised her. In a suit, was that? Yes? A silence. Oh. Then, is it over? She thought about Lanford in the government vehicle, about Aldrich upstairs being processed, about the drive with 43 files and the envelope with 3 months of communications and the batch operation that hadn't executed and the records that were still intact on the 4th floor. Not over, she said, but the part that was in this building tonight is mostly done. Are you okay? She considered the question seriously, which it deserved. I'm functional, she said. That's the honest answer. Okay? A pause. Emily, for what it's worth, I should have said something sooner. When I saw the chart flags, when I watched them escort you out, I should have... Tomas, I know there's no fixing it. It's noted, she said, and it's done. Get some sleep. She ended the call and sat down on one of the chairs that lined the corridor wall because her legs had been moving for 3 hours, and she was 31 years old and hadn't eaten since that toast she'd made herself at 9 p.m., and the night was starting to register in her body in ways she could no longer completely manage away. Wakefield appeared from the stairwell and found her in the chair and sat down in the one next to her, which was the most informal she'd seen him all night. McCallum's out of surgery, he said. Successful repair. She'll be in recovery for several hours. Emily let out a breath. Good. She's going to want to talk to someone, when she's capable, someone who can explain what happened in this hospital before she arrived. He looked at her sideways. Not tonight. Not tonight, she agreed. They sat for a moment. It was almost 1 in the morning. The corridor hummed. Somewhere below them, the main power grid came back online in sections. She could hear it in the way the building's sound profile changed, the full electrical hum returning, the overhead lights clicking back to life one section at a time. The facilities man, she said, the one who cut the power. Building security picked him up in the east corridor 15 minutes ago. He made it to the service door and found it locked from inside. Wakefield's voice carried nothing extra. Which it was, because you came in that way. She hadn't thought about that. She'd propped nothing, changed nothing. The door had closed and sealed behind her when she'd entered, and she hadn't considered it again. But the lock had worked in her favor and against his. which was the kind of small material fact that changed outcomes. "He worked for Palladian?" she asked. "We think so. He was hired through a staffing agency that Palladian funds. We're pulling the thread now." He paused. "He's the one who sent the text." She looked at him. "He's the one who told us about the drive?" "Appears so. We think he copied the drive before handing it to Lanford, kept a copy himself, and when he realized tonight was going the wrong direction, he calculated that giving us the information about the original copy was the least bad option for his own situation. So Lanford copying those files created a record that the facilities man copied his insurance, and the facilities man's insurance became our evidence when he tried to cover his own exposure." "Yes." "They kept records of each other." "People always do." Wakefield rubbed the side of his face, which was the first tired gesture she'd seen from him. "It's the thing about these operations. Everyone builds their own insurance, and the insurance is always a record of the thing they're insuring against." Emily sat with that. She thought about Darlene Voss, who had amended charts at a nursing station terminal and left 14 months of timestamps. She thought about Lanford, who had kept screenshots of instruction texts. She thought about Aldrich, who had carried a sealed envelope for 3 months, waiting for a reason not to need it. She thought about Slade, who had made a PowerPoint. She thought about Roy Callahan, who had written down 3 concerns before his surgery. The wrong people had kept the wrong records, and Roy Callahan had kept the right ones, and it hadn't saved him. But it was part of the reason the people who hadn't saved him were now in federal custody in a hospital corridor in Silver Harbor at 1 in the morning. "I want a copy of Roy Callahan's flagged concerns," she said. "The original 3, whatever we recovered. They're in the files from Lanford's drive. The originals were in his records, cleared but not deleted, because deletion would have created an absence that was harder to explain than a cleared flag." Wakefield looked at her. "We have them. Danny Callahan needs to see them." "He will." She nodded. She sat in the corridor for another moment, and then she stood, because sitting was starting to feel like something she couldn't afford to get too comfortable with. She was going to need to give another formal statement. She was going to need to talk to the Federal Review Board. She was going to need a lawyer and a plan for the data theft case that was now presumably evaporating, but presumably and legally were different things. There was a lot of process between here and anything resembling finished. But Wakefield's team had the records. Aldrich's envelope was in an evidence bag. Lanford's drive had 43 files. The batch suppression operation had not executed. Slade was in federal custody and his lawyers had walked. She picked up her jacket from the chair where she'd set it. The USB drive was still in the pocket. She closed her fingers around it for a moment and then let go. "I need coffee," she said. "There's a machine on the first floor that's running on backup power. Does it make anything resembling actual coffee?" "It makes something hot and brown." "That's enough," she said, and they walked toward the elevator together, and the overhead lights were coming back on in sections around them, and the building was returning to itself, and in the server room on the 4th floor, the records that hadn't been deleted sat exactly where they needed to be, intact and time-stamped, and waiting for the process that would give them their full weight. She was almost to the elevator when Garrett appeared at the end of the corridor, moving with a specific kind of purpose that she'd learned in the past 48 hours to read correctly. "We have a problem," he said. She stopped. "What kind?" "The Palladian board members that Slade presented to, the 6 who received that meeting summary." He stopped in front of her. His face had the quality of someone delivering something he'd rather not deliver. "2 of them are federal officials. One is a current member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and one is a deputy director at the Department of Health and Human Services." The corridor was fully lit now, clear and bright and showing everything. "They were in the room when he presented dead patients as a performance metric," Emily said. "They signed the meeting summary. Their names are in the document." She looked at him. "Then this isn't a hospital case anymore." "It hasn't been a hospital case for about 3 hours," Garrett said. "But now we have the names to prove it, and the people whose names those are have enough authority to make the next step of this significantly more complicated than tonight." She thought about the process she'd described to herself a moment ago. The Federal Review Board, the statements, the timeline. She thought about how it had felt like something that would be long and slow and institutional. She thought about 2 federal officials who had been in a room where a PowerPoint explained 8 deaths as managed outcomes, and who had signed a summary confirming they'd received the information, and who were somewhere right now. Not in this hospital, not in federal custody, but somewhere, calculating exactly how much they could make disappear before the morning. "Where's the document now?" she asked. "Evidence bag. Secure." He looked at her steadily. "But Emily, the agency that would normally receive this kind of referral is the same agency that the deputy director works for." She stood in the lit corridor of Northgate Medical Center at 1:17 in the morning and understood exactly what he was telling her. The evidence was secure. The chain of custody was intact, and the next link in the institutional chain that should receive it had a reason to not want to receive it. "Who else knows?" she asked. "On our side, 3 people including you and me." He paused. "And Wakefield." She looked toward the elevator where Wakefield had stopped walking when Garrett appeared. He was listening, and he already knew. She could tell that from his face. "Then we need to decide," she said, "who we trust with it next." The 3 of them stood in the corridor, and the hospital hummed around them, and outside the harbor lights were still on. And the city was doing what cities did at this hour. Moving, breathing, not knowing what had happened in one of its buildings tonight, and not knowing what was about to happen to 2 names on a signed document that was sitting in an evidence bag and could not be unseen by anyone who had looked at it. Her phone buzzed one last time. An email. Unknown sender, no subject line, sent to the personal address she'd used for exactly 2 things in the past week: backing up the documentation she'd built from Lanford's files and forwarding the package to Garrett's secure address. The email contained a single attachment. She opened it. It was a photograph. A scanned document, handwritten, dated 3 months ago. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the kind of handwriting people used when they were writing something they wanted to be perfectly legible. It was a letter, addressed to the office of the Inspector General, signed at the bottom by Vera Aldrich, but it had never been sent. Until now. And the last line of the letter read, "If you are reading this and no action has been taken, the reason is that the 2 individuals named on page 3 have ensured it. Their names are..." The attachment cut off. Page 3 didn't load. Emily looked at Garrett. She looked at Wakefield. She turned the phone to show them the screen, and she watched their faces, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet. Someone had sent this. Someone who had access to a letter that Aldrich had written 3 months ago and never sent. Who had sent it tonight to an address that had only been used twice in the past week, both times by Emily. Someone who knew what she'd done, someone who was watching, someone who was not in this corridor and had not been in this building tonight, and was either the most dangerous ally she'd ever had or something considerably worse. Her phone screen was still on. The attachment was still showing the incomplete text. The loading circle turned. Once. Twice. Page 3 did not load. Part 5. The loading circle stopped. Then the attachment refreshed, and page 3 appeared. 2 names. She read them once and then a second time, because the first time felt like something her eyes had manufactured. The second time confirmed they were real. She didn't say them aloud. She turned the phone so Wakefield could read it, and she watched the particular stillness that moved through him. Not surprised, because men like Wakefield had spent careers learning to absorb bad information without broadcasting it, but something adjacent to a reckoning, the kind of stillness that preceded significant action. Garrett read it over Wakefield's shoulder. He straightened up and looked at the ceiling for 1 second, which was his version of the same thing. "The deputy director I can work around," Garrett said quietly. "He's HHS, not DOD. Our referral chain doesn't run through him." "The Appropriations Committee member does affect your funding authorization," Wakefield said. "I know." Garrett looked at Emily. "But right now, tonight, what matters is that we know, and we have the document. And the document exists in 3 evidence bags and on a server that neither of those men can touch without triggering an access log that would be, at this point, the least subtle thing anyone has ever done." "Who sent the email?" she asked. "I don't know yet." He held her gaze. "But whoever it is, they sent it to your address specifically, which means they trust you to know what to do with it." She thought about that. She thought about the particular weight of being the person that someone unknown had decided to trust with something this dangerous. In the middle of a night that was already carrying more weight than she'd planned for when she'd walked out of Northgate Medical Center 29 hours ago with a paper bag and a suspended badge. "We need to move the referral tonight," she said. "Before morning, before either of those men knows what Aldrich's letter contains." Agreed. Wakefield was already on the radio. It took 4 hours. She was not present for most of it. Most of it happened in secure channels and encrypted transfers and phone calls made from the mobile command unit in the north lot. What she was present for was giving her third formal statement of the night, this one to a woman who arrived at 2:30 a.m. in a government vehicle with federal credentials from an office that wasn't HHS and wasn't the IG's office, but sat above both of them in the referral hierarchy, in the specific way that things sat above other things when the people below them had become part of the problem. The woman's name was Deputy Inspector Walsh, and she was 58, and she had the quality of someone who had spent a career being underestimated in rooms run by people like Marcus Slade, which gave her and Emily a wordless point of recognition that passed between them in the first 30 seconds and wasn't mentioned again because it didn't need to be. Emily told her everything, in order, without editorializing. Walsh took notes in a system that Emily couldn't see and asked 8 questions, all of which were precise, none of which were the wrong questions. At the end of it, Walsh looked at her notes. "The email with the attachment. You still have it?" "Yes." "We'll need the full header data. Our tech team can trace the originating server." "Will that tell you who sent it?" "It'll tell us where it came from. That's a starting point." Walsh looked at her. "You did something significant tonight. I want to make sure you understand the scope of it, because it's going to get complicated before it gets simple. And people in your position sometimes don't hear this clearly enough." She paused. "The complication is not a sign that you were wrong. It's a sign that what you found was real enough to matter to people with the power to complicate things." Emily thought about the word complicate. It was a polite word for a process that was going to involve federal hearings and licensing board reviews and depositions, and probably 18 months of her life being examined by people whose job was to find every version of the story that made her look like less than what she was. "I know," she said. Walsh nodded. She closed her notes. "Get some rest." Emily left Northgate Medical Center at 4:47 in the morning through the main entrance, which she'd been escorted out of 40 hours ago through the side. She wasn't sure if she'd planned it that way. Probably not. She wasn't the kind of person who planned symbolic gestures, but she walked through the main doors and across the lobby and out into the early morning air of Silver Harbor, which smelled like salt and the industrial residue of a harbor district not quite awake yet. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the cold hit her face. Her car was in the parking structure. She walked to it. She drove home. She slept for 6 hours without moving, which was the most thorough sleep she'd had in a week. The weeks that followed were not clean. She had known they wouldn't be, and knowing hadn't fully prepared her for the specific texture of the uncleanliness, the licensing board process that ran parallel to the federal investigation, the data theft case that Northgate's counsel tried to sustain for 3 weeks before the evidentiary reality made it untenable, and they withdrew it without comment. The deposition process that required her to sit in rooms with lawyers and repeat herself with precision while they looked for inconsistencies, she hadn't left them. She got a lawyer named Patricia Arroyo, who was 61 and had spent 30 years doing exactly this kind of work, and who had the particular quality of someone who had stopped being impressed by institutional authority around 1998 and hadn't looked back. Arroyo looked at the full case file on their first meeting and said, "They're going to try to make this about your judgment. We're going to make it about their records." She was right. That was exactly what happened, and that framing was exactly what won. The data theft case was officially dismissed on a Tuesday morning in a 1-paragraph notice. Emily read the paragraph twice and then called Arroyo, who said, "I know," before Emily said anything because Arroyo had gotten the same notice 20 minutes earlier. There was a brief silence on the phone that was the closest thing to celebration that either of them permitted themselves, because the licensing board process was still running and celebration was something that waited for finished. The licensing board cleared her 6 weeks after that. Fully. No conditions, no monitoring period, no language in the finding that left room for a future challenge. The panel chair read the determination in a room that contained Emily, Arroyo, a board recorder, and no one from Northgate, because by the time the determination was read, the people who would have been there to contest it were otherwise occupied. Marcus Slade had been indicted on 11 counts, including fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and criminal negligence resulting in death. He entered a not guilty plea in a federal courtroom that was covered by 3 local news stations and 2 national outlets. He was released on bail and spent the next 8 months in a process that ground him down in the specific way that federal criminal proceedings ground people down. Not dramatic, not quick, just relentless and thorough and public. His conviction, when it came, included 9 of the 11 counts. His sentencing hearing was a full-day proceeding in which the families of 6 of the 8 patients were present. Roy Callahan's son, Danny, read a statement that was 4 minutes long and that Emily had not been asked to review in advance, though he had sent her a text the night before that said simply, "I wrote it myself. You told me I could." She had told him that. She'd told him everything, as promised, in a meeting 3 weeks after the night at the hospital. Her, Danny Callahan, and a victim services coordinator from the federal investigation. It had been the hardest conversation of the entire process, harder than any deposition, harder than the licensing board. Danny was 28 and looked like someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and hadn't yet learned to put it down. She didn't tell him the clinical details in a way that was clinical. She told him what his father had done, the care he'd taken, the things he'd written down, the fact that Roy Callahan had tried, specifically and clearly, to protect himself, and that the protection had been deliberately removed from his record. "He did everything right," Danny said. "He did everything you were supposed to do." "He did," she said, "and it should have worked. The fact that it didn't isn't on him." Danny sat with that for a long time. She let him. Doctor. Preston Hale lost his surgical privileges pending review of his operative records, which the federal investigation had prompted the state medical board to examine. The review found a pattern of complication documentation that the board's investigation panel described as inconsistent with clinical reality. His license was suspended for 18 months and reinstated with conditions that functionally ended his career as a surgeon. He did not face criminal charges, which was the outcome Emily found hardest to accept, and eventually did accept, because accepting what the process produced was the only way to stay functional inside the process. Lanford pled guilty to falsification of medical records and obstruction. He cooperated. His sentencing reflected the cooperation in the way sentencing reflected cooperation, reduced but not absent. Darlene Voss was charged with professional misconduct and accessory to falsification. She received a reduced charge in exchange for testimony, and her nursing license was revoked permanently. Emily found out about the revocation on a Thursday from Arroyo, who had noted it in a case update, and she sat with her coffee and thought about 16 years and a desk at a nursing station and a woman who had said those flags were administrative overcautions, with the particular tone of someone who had needed to believe it and had stopped believing it and had kept going anyway. She didn't feel satisfied. She felt something that was more complicated and less photogenic than satisfaction. She felt the weight of 8 names and the particular quality of a case that had been won in all the ways that mattered and still could not give back the thing it was built around. Vera Aldrich testified at Slade's trial and at the proceedings against the 2 federal officials, whose names had spent 3 weeks in news cycles after the referral became public. The deputy director resigned. The Appropriations Committee member did not resign and was not convicted because the evidence established presence and receipt of information but not active participation, and the law in that specific instance required more than the facts could provide. That was the outcome Emily discussed with Arroyo on the phone for 40 minutes, cycling through the same territory in different words before Arroyo said, "He knows what he did. The people who matter know what he did. That's not nothing." It wasn't nothing. Emily chose to hold it that way, which was a choice she had to make more than once. The sender of the email was eventually identified through header analysis as a server registered to a private data security firm that had, 4 months earlier, been quietly retained by Vera Aldrich. She had hired them before the night at the hospital. She had given them the letter and instructed them to send it, with the named page to Emily Hart's email address specifically, if and only if a federal declaration was triggered at Northgate Medical Center. A conditional release set up 3 months in advance by a woman who had been waiting for either an exit or an ending and had prepared for both. Emily learned this from Garrett, over coffee at the same bad diner near the harbor, where she'd sat across from him the night this started. She sat with it. She chose you, Garrett said. She read my nursing notes for 2 years. She knew you'd know what to do with it. Emily looked at her coffee. She could have sent it to a journalist, to a federal office directly, to anyone. She sent it to you. He shrugged, not dismissively, just honestly. Some people recognize the right person for the job. It's not always the person with the most authority. Sometimes it's just the person who's been paying attention. The Palladian Group lost its contract with Northgate Medical Center 31 days after Slade's indictment, when the hospital board, newly constituted, 3 members replaced, voted to terminate the relationship following an emergency audit that found contract irregularities totaling $11 million over 4 years. The audit had been initiated based on Emily's original documentation, cross-referenced with the files from Lanford's Drive. She never appeared before the board. She didn't need to. The records did that work. Northgate itself underwent a structural review that lasted 8 months and produced a 40-page remediation plan. New clinical compliance protocols, new adverse event reporting requirements, a patient safety officer position created specifically to sit outside the administrative hierarchy and report directly to the board. The person hired for that position was not Emily Schick. She hadn't applied, and she didn't regret not applying because it was the right job for someone who wanted to rebuild a system from inside it. And she had learned something about herself during the months of this process, which was that she was better at breaking things that were wrong than building things that were right, and that knowing the difference between those two capabilities was not a weakness. Senator Diane McCallum recovered. She was discharged from the hospital 19 days after her emergency surgery, and she returned to her committee work 2 months after that. Her first public statement on return mentioned patient safety reform in general terms. 4 months later, her committee produced a bill that addressed adverse event reporting requirements for hospitals receiving federal funding, stricter thresholds, independent verification, mandatory disclosure timelines. It passed. It was not named after anyone. Emily preferred it that way. Named things attracted the kind of attention that made the actual content secondary, and the content was what mattered. McCallum's office sent her a letter. Not a form letter. A specific one, written in the senator's own phrasing, that said, "What you did in that hospital required a kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. I'm grateful for it, and I intend to spend some time making sure it wasn't wasted." Emily read it twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer of her kitchen table next to the card she'd bought for Walter Grimes, and a pen she kept meaning to replace. 11 months after the night of the federal declaration, Emily Hart walked into a conference room at Silver Harbor General, a different hospital, one she'd started working at 8 weeks after her license was cleared, where the nursing director had called her in for a meeting that turned out to be a job offer before she'd finished sitting down. She'd been working there long enough to know the building's rhythms and its quirks, and the nurses who paid attention and the ones who didn't, and she was, by most accounts, exactly the kind of nurse the floor had needed without knowing it needed. The conference room held 9 people, 3 administrators, 2 physicians, 2 nurses from her floor, a patient advocate, and Tomas Reyes, who had left Northgate 6 weeks after the investigation went public and had been at Silver Harbor General for 5 months, which Emily had not engineered and had not discouraged. He was a good nurse. He paid attention now in a way he hadn't before. She suspected he'd be paying attention for the rest of his career. The meeting was about the implementation of a new patient safety reporting protocol that Silver Harbor General was adopting ahead of the regulatory requirement, ahead of it, rather than in response to it, because the nursing director had read the McCallum committee bill and decided that waiting for a mandate was the wrong posture. Emily had been asked to lead the protocol development. She'd said yes. She'd said it without hesitation and without the particular weight of significance she might have attached to it in other circumstances, because the work was practical and specific, and she was good at practical and specific. And the fact that it had come from everything that had happened was not something she needed to explain to anyone in the room. They knew enough. They knew what mattered. She stood at the front of the room with a folder and a dry erase marker. And she didn't think about Marcus Slade in a federal courtroom, or Darlene Voss in a licensing board hearing, or the 2 names on page 3 of a letter that had spent 3 months waiting to be sent. She didn't think about the paper bag she'd walked out of Northgate with, or the note on her windshield, or the 47 seconds in an operating room that had set everything in motion. She thought about Roy Callahan, who had written 3 things down. She thought about what it meant to be in a room and decide that what you'd noticed was worth saying, even when the room was arranged against you saying it. She thought about the particular discipline of staying functional when everything around you was built to make you feel like you weren't enough. When the hierarchy and the assumptions and the accumulated weight of people deciding what you were good for all pressed in the same direction, and you had to decide in the quiet space inside all of that what you actually knew. She thought about what it had cost. Not abstractly, actually. The specific cost of the nights and the process and the 18 months of her life being examined and the weight of 8 names she carried in a way that wouldn't fully resolve because some things didn't resolve. They just became part of the load you learned to carry without letting it change your gait. She opened the folder. The goal of this protocol, she said, is to make sure that when someone on this floor notices something wrong, they have a pathway to say, so that doesn't depend on whether the person above them wants to hear it. She looked at the room, the 9 faces, some attentive and some still calibrating what kind of meeting this was going to be. That pathway needs to be structural, not cultural, not aspirational, structural, because culture can be pressured and aspirations can be managed, but a structural requirement with a timestamp and a paper trail is something else. She wrote 3 words on the board. Notice, document, escalate. Every nurse in this hospital is going to learn these steps and what they mean procedurally, not as a suggestion, as a standard. She turned back to the room. And the second part of this protocol, the part that matters as much as the first, is that no one who uses this pathway faces professional consequences for using it. That protection is explicit. It's in writing. It covers everyone from the newest hire to the charge nurses. She paused. Because a reporting system that people are afraid to use isn't a reporting system. It's decoration. Tomas was taking notes. The patient advocate was nodding. One of the physicians, older, the kind who had seen enough iterations of institutional change to have default skepticism about all of them, had his arms crossed but was listening, which was its own kind of progress. She talked for 40 minutes and answered 11 questions and stayed in the room for another 20 while the working group formed around specific implementation tasks. When it was over, she walked down the hall to the nursing station and checked on a patient whose post-op pain levels she'd been watching since morning, and the numbers were where they should be, and she documented them, and she moved on to the next thing. The harbor was visible from the window at the end of the corridor, the same harbor it had always been, the same city, the same light off the water at this hour. Silver Harbor. The city she'd moved to because it was unremarkable, and she'd wanted unremarkable, and it had turned out to be neither unremarkable nor a place she was going to leave. She thought about what Wakefield had said in the corridor 11 months ago. I should have found you sooner. She thought about what she'd said back. We'll talk about that later. They'd had that conversation. It had been neither comfortable nor finished, the way real conversations about real things never fully finished. They talked about the years she'd spent building a life that didn't announce itself, and about whether that had been a way of resting or a way of hiding, and she'd said she wasn't sure it was possible to fully know the difference from inside it. He'd said that was probably true. They'd left it there. She wasn't hiding now. She didn't know exactly what she was doing instead. Not the clean word for it, not the version that fit in a sentence. She was working. She was building something with structure and timestamps and explicit protections for people who noticed wrong things and said so. She was doing it in a building that hadn't broken her and working with people who were still learning to trust that the work mattered. She was 32 years old. She was not the person she'd been when she walked into Northgate Medical Center for the first time. And she was not entirely different from her either. She still moved like someone trained for worse rooms. She still noticed the things other people walked past. She still preferred to say the hard thing plainly rather than wrap it in language designed to make the recipient comfortable. She was not soft about what had happened. She didn't think she was supposed to be. 8 people had died, and the process that was supposed to protect them had been built to benefit from their deaths. And that was a fact she was going to carry into every room she walked into for the rest of her career, not as grief performance, but as fuel. The specific kind of fuel that came from knowing exactly what the cost of silence was and deciding, without drama, that you were not going to be quiet. The thing they'd never understood about her, Slade, Darlene, Hale, all of them, was that she hadn't been quiet because she didn't know. She'd been quiet because she was building. And there was a difference between a person who doesn't speak and a person who is choosing when. She turned away from the window. Down the corridor, a monitor alarmed, not urgently, just the persistent tone of a reading that needed a check. She recognized the room number. She was already moving toward it, unhurried and precise, the way she moved toward every room that needed her. The hallway was bright. The work was specific. The next thing was the next thing. And after that, there would be another, and she would be there for all of them. Not because the past had made her fearless, it hadn't, and she wouldn't have trusted herself if it had, but because she had learned the difference between fear that stopped you and fear that you carried alongside everything else, and she had made her choice about which kind she was going to have. She pushed through the door. She got to work.